For those of you who are watching, it's an honor and pleasure to talk to you about my experience at Guantanamo today. I am following the chat, so if there's anything that's not heard or can't be heard in my presentation, please hit send a note in the chat so I can see. But I was the U.S. Army Muslim Chaplain assigned to Guantanamo back in 2002 and 2003. So this is very shortly after 9/11. And prior to that, I was one of the first Muslim chaplains brought into the U.S. Army of the Islamic faith, and was in the Army serving a growing need at that time. In my early experience in the military, I had seen that there were chaplains, Jewish chaplains, and during the first Gulf War, saw the growing number of Muslims that were entering the ranks of the U.S. military and recognized that there were no Muslims. So I set out a path to try and help fulfill that role, and would leave active duty, do some religious studies overseas, and then came back in early 2001 and was brought back on. And I branch transferred from the Air Defense Artillery to the Chaplain Corps and became one of our nation's first U.S. Army Muslim chaplains. That was in early 2001, and it was only 9 months later, serving my first assignment as a chaplain in the U.S. military, when the tragic attacks on 9/11 occurred. And it wasn't long after 9/11 where the U.S. military set up the prison camp at Guantanamo to send prisoners, suspected terrorists captured in the war on terror, to Guantanamo. And I was given the assignment in November of 2000 and November 2002 to be the Muslim chaplain of the prison camp. And at first I was given a 6-month assignment, and then after 6 months I was involuntarily extended another 6 months. So that was my assignment at Guantanamo. Before going to Guantanamo, I had saw in the media that it was really a place that I thought I can contribute. First and foremost, with respect to educating the personnel down at Guantanamo about the Islamic religion, about Islam. And I saw many reports in the media on how many of the misunderstandings and misconceptions about Islam led to conflict and religious accommodation issues of the prisoners down at Gitmo. So I felt that by at least one of the contributions I could make would be to educate the prison personnel on the cultural practices of Islam and of Muslims, so that they can better do their jobs, whether it be guards or whatever. However, looking back now, I kind of look at my experience as one that in which I was perhaps being used at the time. The U.S. military, the Pentagon, would state, very publicly when they sent me down to Guantanamo, that they had sent the Muslim chaplain, that was me, down to Guantanamo, and that somehow was an indication that we as a nation were treating these prisoners being held in Guantanamo in a humane fashion, that we were doing what's right, supposedly taking into consideration their faith, Islam, by sending them a Muslim chaplain to work in the prison and to work with them. But in hindsight, looking back, perhaps that was more of a media ploy to try and convince the world that we were indeed doing the right thing. But when I got down to Guantanamo, and the first thing that I recognized was that the operation was utter chaos, and at the time there weren't even what we call in the military standard operating procedures. to guide the military in its mission to carry out this detention operation, and also the intelligence gathering operation by the military intelligence section. There were no standard operating procedures. So one of the first tasks that I was given as a chaplain was to write the standard operating procedures for the religious support section of what would be the standard operating procedures for Guantanamo. And one of the things that I ensured was that my role as a chaplain in the military would be guided by the aspects of the Geneva Conventions. Even though at the time the commander-in-chief, President Bush, had stated that Geneva Conventions didn't apply down in Guantanamo, that this the policy was that this was a different type of war, that Geneva Conventions didn't apply, and that was basically sending signal to people at Guantanamo that perhaps there would be no accountability, that the gloves were off, that they could be necessary because especially intelligence thought they were trying to glean some type of intelligence, some information that would stop the next 9/11, which they fathomed was already in the works, right? So, being in Guantanamo, the first thing I did was to write that section, ensuring that whatever I did in the military was according to the spirit of the Geneva Conventions. First and foremost, the role of the chaplain is to accommodate religious practices, whether it's for military service members who serve in the U.S. military, civilian employees who work on a military installation, or individuals who might be imprisoned or incarcerated by the U.S. military. And that indeed was the situation in Guantanamo. We were holding individuals in Guantanamo. My role as a chaplain, first and foremost, was to accommodate their religious practices. And that's by doctrine, that's by military doctrine. So that was very clear in my mind. And some of the things that I attempted to do in Guantanamo was to accommodate those things. For example, the call to prayer, to ensure that the Islamic call to prayer was made 5 times a day so that the Muslim prisoners could make their daily prayers, to accommodate the fasting during Ramadan, to ensure that each cell had water available so that Muslim prisoners could wash before prayer, etc. Those types of things. The dietary needs, all the food in Guantanamo was considered halal, which is an aspect like kosher in the Jewish religion, that it's properly prepared according to the Islamic dietary practices. I made sure that the meat that was served in Guantanamo was halal. And then I was also able to be able to distribute certain religious items like prayer beads, prayer caps, and I actually have some examples. These are actual prayer caps that were distributed down in Guantanamo to Muslim prisoners for their use when they were being held as prisoners, or even just in prayer, as well as the prayer beads. I was able to distribute prayer beads to prisoners to help them in their daily prayers. So that was I got that authorized by the command, and as well, I was able to get religious literature and religious books to be purchased and distributed amongst the prisoners during that time. So these are the things that I tried to do to ensure that religious practices were accommodated during that time I was down in Guantanamo. But there are other aspects which I came across that were very disturbing, and that's the abuse and the torture that occurred in Guantanamo. And there are many aspects. There are many parts to this part of the story: abuse and torture at Guantanamo. For one, there was certainly physical abuse of prisoners at Guantanamo, and most of that in the interrogation sessions, in the intel gathering operation, which I was far removed from. I was specifically assigned to the detention operation and worked alongside the guards. But when prisoners went to interrogation, this was something that I stayed far away from. But I know that many of the prisoners were indeed physically abused, were in these interrogation sessions, as I witnessed some of the results of those interrogation sessions when prisoners came back to the cell block. So from my own eyes, in the cell blocks, seeing prisoners day in and day out, I saw prisoners who had broken teeth, who had the bruises that they came back from interrogation sessions with. So there was indeed physical abuse at Guantanamo. Also, something else I witnessed when prisoners were escorted, they called it an escort, when the guards escorted prisoners to their interrogation sessions. Sometimes I saw guards actually just literally dragging prisoners who were shackled from their cells through the gravel to these interrogation sessions, dragging these other individuals, these human beings, as if they were inanimate objects through the gravel at Guantanamo. So this was abuse. This was physical abuse. Sometimes, though, there was a physical abuse that happened inside the cell blocks carried out by the guards who were at Guantanamo. There was actually something that was known as we nicknamed it in or not we, but it was nicknamed in Guantanamo as IRFing, and that IRF it referred to the term immediate reaction force or immediate response force, and in actuality, in prison operations, this is technically referred to as forced cell extractions. So sometimes prisoners needed to be forcefully extracted from their cell, and when the prisoners weren't willing to come out of their cells willingly, the immediate reaction force was called upon, and then they were what was called IRFed, where a group of say 5 guard soldiers who were dressed in riot gear with shields, with batons, with knee protectors, chest protectors, helmets. They would come after spraying pepper spray onto the prisoner. They would open the cell door, and then they would rush that prisoner, slam him down to the ground, handcuff him really with big zip ties, which made it very quick and expedient, and they would drag the prisoner out. And this became a very abusive practice, mainly in my view, because these forced cell extractions, these IRFings would be ordered or would take place for what in my view were silly reasons, not reasons where a prisoner would genuinely need to be extracted from a cell. And I'll give you an example. For example, it was allowed for a prisoner to have a styrofoam cup in their cell. That was allowed for prisoners. However, prisoners wanted to use that styrofoam cup for multiple purposes. One, of course, was for drinking, but another purpose was because they had a toilet facility in their own cell. They would want to use the cup with water to help clean themselves after they use the bathroom. So, of course, you don't want to use the same cup that you would use that you drink from. So sometimes guards would allow them to have a second styrofoam cup for the toilet and one for the purpose of drinking. Right? But then when the next guard shift came on duty, other guards who were not so friendly would say, oh, they got 2 styrofoam cups. One of those styrofoam cups would be considered what they termed contraband, illegal contraband. And the punishment for having contraband in your cell would be confinement in some of the maximum security units, solitary confinement cells. So prisoners were then told, okay, you got a second cup in your cell. That's contraband. You're being punished and have to go to solitary confinement. So prisoners wouldn't want to go to solitary confinement because another guard gave them a second cup. And so what would happen was they would call the IRF team, the force, and these prisoners would get beat down simply because a previous guard shift gave them a second styrofoam cup. So in my view, this was a misuse of the policy, a misuse of what sometimes is necessary, a forced cell extraction. And in that process, prisoners were beaten and abused. So that was the physical abuse, but there was also some other types of abuse that went on in Guantanamo, and I saw it as religious persecution. I saw how religion in Guantanamo was being used as a weapon. Now, all the prisoners in Guantanamo were Muslim. They were all of the Islamic faith, and so whether it was the guard force or the interrogation sessions, they often use different aspects of Islam and the cultural practices of Muslims against the prisoners to try and break them or to try and pressure them to give information, like say in an intelligence or interrogation session. And let me give you a couple examples of how that was done. One, Muslims, the Muslim holy book is the Quran. That's considered by Muslims to be the literal words of God, right? So, in an interrogation session, for example, it was reported back to me by prisoners that interrogators would take the Quran and hold it in front of a shackled prisoner and would throw it on the floor, or they would step on it, or they would sit on it, things like that in front of the prisoner. Because these interrogators, whether they were military or civilian interrogators like the CIA or the FBI or the intelligence or the Defense Intelligence Agency, there were a number of different types of personnel that were in this intelligence gathering operation, not just military. And they would essentially desecrate the Quran in front of that prisoner. So this was using religion as a weapon, some type of psychological torture, so to speak. And this got so bad where the prisoners themselves decided that by and large, as a whole, as a group, all 600 and so of them that were there at the time when I was at Guantanamo, decided that because of the desecration of the Quran by interrogators, that all of the prisoners would go silent. None of them would speak to the interrogators about anything. And so this brought the intelligence gathering operation to a dead halt. No information was being gleaned by any prisoner at that time. And the situation became so bad that the command actually came to me to help resolve the situation that was caused by the desecration of the Quran. And in the process, one of the things that I did was I formulated a standard operating procedure specifically for the handling of the Quran for all personnel down at Guantanamo, so they could no longer be abused or used in those interrogation sessions in a way that it would be disrespected or desecrated. But the point is, that's one way in which religion was being used as a weapon in Guantanamo. Another way in which religion was being used as a weapon in Guantanamo in a way to persecute Muslim prisoners was the use of female interrogators in Guantanamo. Not specifically the use of female interrogators, but how they employed female interrogators in the interrogation sessions. So, for example, many of the Muslims, because they came from very orthodox, conservative Islamic societies, where any physical contact with members of the opposite sex outside their immediate family members, like their mother, their daughters, their sister, their aunts, their cousins, etc. But anyone outside their family, they had very limited physical or social contact with the opposite sex, with women. What female interrogators did was they would exploit those situations. For example, in the worst way too. So, for example, female interrogators were known to perform scandalous lap dances on shackled prisoners who sat in their chair and couldn't resist. They would do some type of lap dance, something that you might see in a strip club on these prisoners at Guantanamo, because they knew that it would upset them. It would it would essentially be seen by those Muslims as being sexually violated. There were reports of female interrogators who actually physically grabbed the genitals of Muslim male prisoners in the course of interrogating them. Right. So that no doubt is assault. That is sexual assault. Right. So these are the types of things that were being employed specifically by female prisoners, female interrogators, because they knew this went against concepts of Islamic doctrine in terms of male and female relationships. Right. A third way in which religion was being used as a weapon, and this was not only told to me by prisoners, but it was also by some of the translators who worked in those interrogation sessions. For those who don't know, the primary Islamic belief or religious belief is the belief in one God, a pure monotheistic faith. That's essentially what the meaning of Islam is, to believe in one God. And the Arabic word for God, the proper name for God in Arabic is Allah. It's written A-L-L-A-H, Allah. That's the proper name in the Arabic religion for God. And people of the of the Christian faith and Jewish faith also, who speak Arabic, refer to God as Allah. In these other types of sessions, there was one specific interrogation room that had marked on the ground in that interrogation room a large circle, and in that circle was a satanic symbol. Now, if you go to Google and just Google satanic symbols, you'll get this star-shaped symbol, the satanic star. Right? That was painted in the center of this circle in an interrogation room. And what these interrogators would do is they would take a prisoner and that prisoner to bow down and prostrate, like in the form of the Islamic prayer. So as Muslims, when we pray, we prostrate. We put our forehead to the ground in worship, in honor of worshiping one God. So these Muslim prisoners in these interrogation sessions were forced to bow down and prostrate in the center of this satanic circle, while would scream at them that Satan is your God now, not Allah. Right? So this is how religion was being used as a weapon to try and break these prisoners, because essentially, as President Bush had said, Geneva Conventions didn't apply. The gloves were off, as another administration official would say, and there was no accountability for Guantanamo. But as a chaplain whose primary role was to accommodate religious practice in Guantanamo, these are the types of things that I attempted to address down in Guantanamo. There were other things that were also done in the cell blocks by guards, for example, who wanted to instigate the prisoners. Like when it came time for prayer, when the call to prayer was made, the guards also knew that the time for prayer had come. Of course, they knew that Muslim prisoners would have to wash before the prayer. Each cell had its own little fountain, like a water spigot, where water could be turned on for prisoners to wash before prayer, or to wash themselves, wash their hands or whatever. Guards would sometimes instigate the prisoners by turning off the water to the pipes that went to each cell, so that the prisoners couldn't wash when a prayer time came. Right? They did this to instigate the prisoners, and prisoners would end up responding by just banging on their cell doors and rioting, because the guards would essentially do this to instigate them. Other things guards would sometimes do is, during the time of prayer, they would stomp up and down the cell blocks. In the cell blocks, what you had at the time, Camp Delta, these cell blocks where you had 24 cells on one side, 24 on the other, and a long corridor that went down the middle. Each door was an individual cell. So during the time of prayer, a lot of the prisoners were praying in their cells, and the guards would stomp and make loud noises, banging, trying to interrupt and disturb the prayer. At times, some of the prisoners complained that sometimes the guards would throw pebbles or throw stones at prisoners while they were in prayer, right? And these are the types of things that, of course, when guards do it, yeah, how do you catch a prisoner? How do you catch a guard from committing these types of things? And they were smart as well, because one of the things that I noticed as chaplain, whenever I came into any particular cell block, many of the guards would yell to their colleagues who were on shift, "Chaplain on the block, chaplain on the block." That was an indication that I was coming onto the block, and to warn them that if they were doing anything that they weren't supposed to be doing, they better stop it right now, because the chaplain is there. You're going to get caught, right? So these are the types of things that were happening in Guantanamo. You had persecution, you had physical abuse, you had many things that were going on. When you look at some of the reports and the investigations that were done into Guantanamo, you find a lot of things that occurred, a lot of abuses that occurred that were out of my view, but I learned later in these reports that happened at Guantanamo. By and large, for the most part, I had been someone who was of the view that waterboarding, which is unanimously across the board, across the world, to be considered torture. It had, for the most part, been my view that waterboarding did not occur. And it was my view that there were prisoners who were at Guantanamo that had been waterboarded, and we know of those specific accounts because we read them in other reports, like the Senate torture report of prisoners who were held in the secret CIA black. That's where the waterboarding, in my view, occurred. And then later, those prisoners were emptied out of the CIA black sites and later brought to Guantanamo in 2006, several years after I was at Guantanamo. But nevertheless, I had been, for the most part, of the opinion that waterboarding actually didn't occur in Guantanamo, that they occurred in the CIA black sites, but that there were prisoners who were boarded, who at one time were in those CIA black sites, who are now at Guantanamo, that did experience waterboarding. But my view in 2021 changed. And that was because after the release of the film, The Martinian, about the former Guantanamo prisoner, Mohamedou Slahi, who would, from his cell, write a New York Times bestseller after his writings about his entire experience was then passed on to his attorneys, and then his attorneys collected them and then published in a book called Guantanamo Diary. And that was a bestseller. But that book was made into a movie. And that movie depicted one of the ways in which Mohamedou Slahi, the former prisoner at Gitmo from Mauritania, was tortured. And if anyone has seen the film, you'll recognize the scene where they took Slahi out on a speedboat into the Guantanamo Bay. And as they sped him around the speedboat, they bent him over the side of the boat, submerging his head into the water, where he felt like he was being drowned. So this is, in my view, a form of waterboarding. It's not the traditional form where you see a prisoner strapped on a incline facing down, where they put a cloth over the face and pour water to get that sensation that a person is drowning. That traditional way that we when we normally talk of waterboarding may not necessarily have been done at Gitmo, but the way in which Muhammadu Salahi was treated in this speedboat on the Guantanamo Bay, having his head submerged in water as the boat sped around the bay, to me it is a form of waterboarding, and my view has changed that yes, waterboarding now, uh, I can say, did happen at Guantanamo Bay. And from my understanding, Muhammadu Salahi, when he was going through what they called this special interrogation process, was occurring during the latter portion of the time that I was at Guantanamo Bay. So I've talked about some of the ways in which that prisoners were abused, how they were religiously persecuted, psychologically abused, both in the cell blocks and in the interrogation sessions. One of the things that I didn't mention yet was the sensory deprivation that was applied to prisoners at Guantanamo, where, especially when prisoners came in, they had the shackles at their wrists, at their waist, their ankles. They had the earmuffs over the ears and these blackened out goggles put over their eyes, right? And that was done to instill fear and intimidation in the prisoner. And this is something I'm intimately familiar with, because not only first did I observe it at Guantanamo on the prisoners, but then after I addressed many that I had about how prisoners were treated, I myself was then arrested. And then I was taken from Guantanamo, actually arrested in secret when I came back into the United States after serving 10 months in Guantanamo, secretly arrested, and I was brought to this facility known as the Consolidated Naval Brig down in Charleston, South Carolina. And this was a prison facility where the administration was holding what they termed U.S. citizen enemy combatants. There were three others that were held there: Yasser Hamdi, Saleh El Mari, and a third prisoner who they termed enemy combatants, but were either U.S. citizens or taken into custody on U.S. soil in the United States. And then they put me in this prison. And when they took me to this prison, I also subjected to what was called sensory deprivation, where they had put blackened out goggles on my eyes. They put the muffs on my ears. I was shackled at the wrists, the waist, the ankles, right? So I understood the ramifications, the meaning of this when I was subjected to this type of torture. And for me, I recognized that perhaps this meant that even me, as a U.S. citizen, was perhaps having all of my rights stripped away. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and I was eventually given access to an attorney. I was held, and then the military attempted to prosecute me for spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny and sedition, death penalty charges that carried a death penalty. And I was threatened with the death penalty by military prosecutors. But I was put under the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, held under military law, and actually in the end, because there absolutely was no evidence that I had violated any law, and that the only thing that I had really done was concerns about how prisoners were being mistreated and abused at Guantanamo. All of the accusations and charges that were brought against me was dropped, and that I was reinstated. After which, I would resign my commission from the U.S. military, and mainly because I was put under a gag order. They told me that I was not allowed to speak out about how I was treated, what I knew about Guantanamo, or anything else about my military experience connected to Guantanamo. So I left the U.S. military, I cut all my ties, and then went and authored a book exposing a lot of what I talked to you today, and about my entire experience at Guantanamo. Today, where are we? We have 40 prisoners that are still in Guantanamo. Let me read you actually 39 prisoners are still in Guantanamo, and let me read you by the numbers what that amounts to. There are 39 prisoners still in Guantanamo after President Obama in 2009 had promised to close Guantanamo after promising to close it during his campaign for president. I went through his whole 8 years, didn't close Guantanamo, and as such, there are still 39 prisoners there. There are 10 who were cleared for release. There are 13 prisoners who are being subjected to what's known as military commissions or being tried for war crimes under a separate type military system to try war crimes in Guantanamo. Many law experts which say this does not are not fair and just. And there are 2 who have actually already been convicted by these military commissions, war crimes tribunals, and are serving sentences at Guantanamo. And there are 14 prisoners who are being held indefinitely without charge. And that term is forever prisoner, meaning they're being held indefinitely. They're not going to be charged because a lot of whatever information they may have on these prisoners can't be used because they were tortured out. This information was tortured out of them through coercion, and that's possible in any court of law. And yet they won't be released. So they're held indefinitely without charge. They'll never see their day in court, and this term is called the forever prisoner. So those are the 39 prisoners still remaining. And today, Guantanamo falls in the lap of President Biden. President Biden was Obama's vice when Obama was elected, and promised to close Guantanamo. So now the mission, now the purpose, the promise to close Guantanamo falls really squarely in President Biden. And the question is whether or not he's willing to do that. And the situation that as of today is that he has set forth a review of the prison in order to help him better assess, and hopefully we'll see this prison closed by the end of his first term.
I just wanted to give you a heads up that the session is officially over, but you can continue to talk. Our next, we're going into a break of 15 minutes now before the next session starts at 1:00 p.m. So feel free to continue.
I'd just like to say, make a final comment.
Oh, yeah.
The way that Guantanamo is going to be closed is if the public supports it, and if the politicians who promised to close it follow through on those promises. And really, what is required upon us as citizens is to educate ourselves about Guantanamo. And today, I mean, Guantanamo is in its 20th year of existence, and there are a plethora of books that have been written about Guantanamo from different perspectives, from the perspective of prisoners, from the perspective of translators, from the perspective of lawyers, of journalists, of human rights activists, of a military guard wrote his perspective on prisoners at Guantanamo, and an enormous amount of information out there on Guantanamo, and it's really upon us to educate ourselves about Guantanamo and why this has been such a stain on our nation, on the United States' reputation for human rights, and how the keeping of Guantanamo open and keeping prisoners in Guantanamo is really detrimental to us upholding human rights and really trying to strengthen national security. In my view, it's something that weakens our ability, especially when it comes to cooperation from most of our allies across the world, who are by and large against Guantanamo. I really don't know any other nation that supports the keeping of Guantanamo open. So with that, I'd like to really just conclude and really encourage people to really go out and learn more about Guantanamo. I'm reading a note in the chat. This last question, Bruce's question here. Are there any organizations, campaigns, or petitions you follow or join? So one of the things that's good to help educate yourself about Guantanamo is looking into some of these organizations. In quick, I got a couple listed here: Center for Constitutional Rights, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, the Amnesty, Reprieve, the ACLU. These are all organizations that have information about Guantanamo. Some of the more active organizations, though, that are actively advocating for prisoners' release at Guantanamo and for the closing of Guantanamo are organizations like Witness Against Torture, and then also CAGE, or also sometimes referred to as Cage Prisoners, CAGE, which is operated out of the UK in Britain, are two of the foremost organizations are ongoing in terms of their advocacy to get Guantanamo closed. A few months ago, I did see something that's very, very interesting. A group of former prisoners at Guantanamo, all who have authored books about their experience at Gitmo, being prisoners at Gitmo, got together and formulated an 8-step plan which they recommend to help the United States close Guantanamo, and it includes things like releasing or repatriating all of those who have been cleared for release at Guantanamo to send them home, or to release them from Gitmo. Reappoint a special envoy official to head up the review process and the aspects of Guantanamo. Scrapping the military commissions, a judicial system that really does not hold the legal standard, the legal muster that say the federal courts in the United States holds, or even the UCMJ, the system of military law under which service members are held. So a lot of people have issues with the military commission, right? So I found that very interesting that even former prisoners at Guantanamo have gotten together to weigh in and even send their advice to the White House and recommendations on how Guantanamo can be closed.
Yeah. Okay. We have a break for the next 8 or so minutes until the next session begins at 1 p.m. We will be able to collect and send any resources that you have to share with the attendees. So I will send an email to you after the conference asking for any of the organizations, books, and such that you want to share with people. Thank you so much for speaking. I really appreciated your talk and hearing about your experience. It was very moving. I'm sure that's true for all of us.
It's been a pleasure. And I'm glad I can join.